As organizations continually look to improve their security posture, they often tend to focus on threats outside the organization. But with the growth of phishing attacks and compromised credentials, organizations increasingly have to look for insider threats. I'm Wyatt Cash at Scoop News Group, and here to talk about that and how organizations can adapt their security response by gaining complete visibility into the data moving across their enterprise network is Todd, Vice President of Security at Code 42. Tommy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Tommy, let's start by asking, can you share with us why insider risk is an increasing concern and a growing security threat for enterprise security leaders?
Sure. Yeah, there's actually a few reasons why insider risk is becoming a growing concern. And, I think it starts with understanding the types of users that typically exist in an organization. There's actually about four types. There's the unintentional or accidental user, those that are unfamiliar with different tool sets, potentially putting your data at risk through mistakes. It's not really malicious intent. It's just, we're humans, right? We make mistakes. Then you have what we call our departing employees. And it's interesting to note that studies have shown that about 70% of employees have acknowledged taking data from one organization to the next, primarily for personal gain. This is a way for them to get ahead at their next job. It's really not a malicious reason, but it's more of a personal reason. It doesn't necessarily make it right. It's just a very common experience that most organizations have. Then we have what we call the spontaneous malicious users. And these are the ones that, as part of their departure strategy, will take data in a damaging way. And these are born out of kind of a situation. You might have employed somebody for 11 to 15 years, and all of a sudden circumstances have created a scenario where they're unhappy with their situation. Maybe they don't like their return to office, maybe they've been passed over promotion, maybe they don't like the way the direction of the company's going. And so as part of their departure strategy, they try to take data that's damaging to the organization. So we have a little bit of a malicious intent there, but oftentimes the data is not going to completely wreck the organization. And then finally, we have that 1% of users that are malicious users. These are the ones that are bent on taking your trade secrets, your intellectual property, and oftentimes for profit or to give your competitors an advantage. And these are the users that, obviously are the most severe, but they also make up the least amount of your population. When we take into consideration that a way an organization would try to address this is through traditional data protection strategies, oftentimes these strategies create blind spots. They're only looking for specific types of data and they're ignoring everything else. And as a result of that, that other 80% of the data that you're not looking at are oftentimes the value data. These are things like your trade secrets or your intellectual property, or things like a press release or a quarterly earnings report, things that if they got out prematurely, they could actually damage the organization. And then finally, one of the challenges that we see with organizations is taking into the concept of looking at all data and all users, right? Being aware that all pieces of data that exist in your organization have some sort of value, and they really should be seen the same way. They should be something that you take a look at across the board, not just trying to pick and choose through discovery what matters most or what you think matters, because in those situations, you're going to miss something.
Well, what do you see as the biggest challenge that organizations face in trying to actually mitigate insider risks today?
Yeah, we live in a unique world today from a security perspective. Now that we're all working from home, and even with the discussion around return to office becoming more prevalent, we still see a lot of organizations flip-flopping. One day they think that, hey, we're going to bring people back in. Other times they say, now we're going to let people work remotely. The challenge with the remote workforce is that, we've kind of gotten spoiled. We're used to doing our jobs the way we want to do them, how we want to do them, and when we want to do them. And from an organizational perspective, we've actually started to acknowledge that our perimeter controls are no longer effective, right? We're relying heavily on the endpoint to be that guardian of our data, as well as the human being behind the keyboard. And the challenge is that all those investments we made to protect it at the perimeter level have pretty much evaporated. So we now have to find a new way. We put more focus on the endpoint. We think about how do we educate our users, making sure they understand what to do with the data. There's just a different experience from a security perspective. In order to support this model of remote work, we also have to support collaboration. I'm not sharing a cubicle with anybody anymore. Now I have to find ways to share data back and forth, which oftentimes comes without the education necessary for how to use these tools correctly. So you end up in this condition where you have oversharing, you've got inappropriate sharing, maybe you've got wrong recipients, number of different ways mistakes can happen in an organization. And a lot of this has to do with the lack of education, just due to the speed of business, the nature of what we're doing. And we think about some of the challenges that organizations are faced with when it comes to addressing insider risk and turning it into a program. It really needs to rely on that people, process, technology approach. Technology is good, but it also needs to align back to things like your culture and the way you have processes written around what we do from an acceptable use perspective. And then obviously education, making sure your users become that human firewall. Because at the end of the day, they're your first line of defense. Using their brain on how they handle your data is going to be the difference between potentially putting your data at risk or protecting your data. And then finally, when we think about a strategy behind this, often we find ourselves investing in technologies that, for lack of a better term, really look at guilt over innocence. Most technology that does a blocking and tackling approach presumes that you're doing something incorrectly and you're guilty of that, and therefore we're going to stop that from happening. The reality is a better approach is to have more of a trust but verify model. You've hired employees to do a job, you trust that they're going to do that job correctly, but you really need a solution that can verify all of their handling activities are correct, and when they're not, be able to get in the way of that so that we can effectively remediate that.
Well, Tommy, can you share with us some examples of organizations which have adopted a, let's call it, a more holistic approach to security that specifically focuses on data visibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually talked to quite a few organizations that are frustrated by the traditional strategies around things like data loss prevention because they've acknowledged a few things. One, it's extremely disruptive, right? So it gets in the way of user behavior and their user experience. Two, it has very limited view on the data that they're looking at. And three, it's just not consumable. It's not something that we could ever see full efficacy out of because most customers don't normally get to that enforcement stage. So when they approach Code 42, they're looking at it from a vantage point of, I need a better option. I need something that provides me the visibility across the boards, is non-disruptive to my user experience, and still provides me the right level of evidence that I can create that right-sized response. So we're seeing a new way. People are looking at it in a different way and saying, we need to reimagine what security looks like in our environment because we need to support this new effort. We need to support the remote users. We need to think about the collaboration culture. And this is really the reasons why organizations take a look at us and say, okay, you're doing things differently. Let's take a look at that and dig into it a little deeper.
And then lastly, what would you recommend that organizations keep in mind as they look to improve their security posture?
Sure. Yeah, it goes back to that people, process, technology approach. And, since we're kind of centering the conversation around technology, I think it's important to understand that technology can give you the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how. It can give you all that evidence, but what it can't give you is the motive, the intent, the why. And so having all of that other evidence available to a security practitioner allows them to create that right-sized response. Maybe it's a conversation with the employee. Maybe they made a mistake. It's a non-punitive response because we're all humans. We make mistakes. But we also want to be aware of those times when we might have a malicious effort, right? So having the evidence necessary to suggest maybe we have some malicious intent here. And as part of my conversation with that employee, maybe I can uncover that and then I can respond accordingly. And as I mentioned, not every response needs to be punitive. So having a solution that can quickly identify the difference between intentional and unintentional is kind of the gray area that security teams need to be able to operate in. It's not really a black or white approach. It shouldn't be an allow or deny. It really should be we need to operate in gray. We need to be able to say, sometimes we want to allow it, sometimes we don't, but we don't want to rely on technology to be the one to make that decision for us. When we think about, things like, what are we doing for future proofing? How do we make sure that we're keeping ahead of these things? As destinations or what we call vectors continue to evolve, as cloud solution investments continue to grow, as we start seeing data distribution becoming more prevalent. We already had data sprawl leading up to the pandemic. Now it's gotten worse. We might have 5 or 6 different solutions where our data can live. So having a solution that can monitor where data is going, where it's been, who's working with it, how it's being used in your organization, and then get ahead of any new solution without having to reinvent that security strategy is critical in having a successful IRM project.
Well, those are all some great points. Tommy, Todd, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today and share a little bit of your insights on improving organizations' security posture.
Yeah, thanks for having me.